No one listened to us then, so listen to us now. Russia's president has announced the development of advanced Russian arms in response to NATO encirclement and U.S. actions on withdrawing from a ballistic missile treaty and embracing a more aggressive stance on using nuclear weapons. Putin squarely put the blame for this arms race on the U.S., saying Western attempts to limit his country's economy and military have failed miserably. How will the U.S. establishment respond to a more assertive, strong Russia at a time when America's own dominance is on the decline? Join me, Waqar Uzu, as we discuss Russia's newest state-of-the-art arsenal and its implications.
The Russian president says Moscow has tested a number of new advanced strategic weapons which could not be intercepted. Delivering his annual State of the Nation speech in Moscow, Vladimir Putin said the upgraded weapons will render NATO's US-led missile systems useless. He also expressed concern about the new U.S. nuclear posture review, which has lowered the threshold for using nuclear weapons.
We are greatly concerned by some parts of the U.S. nuclear posture, which reduces the benchmark for the use of nuclear weapons. Whatever shooting words one may try to use behind closed doors, we can read what was written.
Elsewhere in his remarks, the Russian president said the country had begun working on ways to counter the U.S. anti-missile capabilities as early as 2004. But that Washington had ignored Moscow's call for dialogue. He stressed that Russia will regard a nuclear attack on its allies as an attack on Russia itself and will immediately respond.
Russia maintains its right to use nuclear weapons only in response to use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies, or in the case of aggression against us, with the use of conventional weapons when the state is under existential threat. Everything is very accurate, clear, and specific.
Putin said those who have fueled the arms race over the last 15 years and imposed unlawful sanctions against Moscow have failed to contain Russia. Last month, the Pentagon released a new aggressive nuclear arms policy which would expand and strengthen the U.S. nuclear weapons capabilities. Under the new policy, Washington said it would use nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack or even a cyber attack. Experts believe that the U.S. and its allies must take Russia's warning seriously and stop playing with fire.
But I think Western public should be aware that behind their back, both Trump and the generals keep on threatening. Trump threatening, North Korea. Pentagon generals develop their doctrine saying, we have nuclear arms. And, but Putin addresses the audience and says, watch out, watch out for your generals, watch out for your leaders. They are playing with fire.
With the new U.S. posture, many believe Washington is poking the Russian bear. The new nuclear strategy could also lead to more confrontation between the U.S. and Russia and is plunging the world into a Cold War era's arms race abyss.
Joining us for tonight's discussion are the editor of Politics First, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who is joining us live from London, and we're also joined by independent scholar Mr. Peter Sinnott, who is joining us live from New York. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Peter, I'll start with you. How significant do you think it is that Russia has been able to build itself up, even under pressure from the West and even encirclement by NATO?
Well, I think the focus, quite clearly, is to have an aggressive capability that can thwart missile defenses. The United States has invested a huge amount of money in building missile defense systems, and Russia now has built what it says are systems that can evade missile defenses. So theirs is certainly the more aggressive stance. These are major systems that they're claiming they have built, including a nuclear-powered torpedo that can travel thousands of kilometers or miles and reach the west coast of the United States, where one supposes if it were detonated, it would destroy the fisheries and make life unlivable. The other one is a drone nuclear missile with nuclear power that would be able to travel thousands and thousands of kilometers or miles and strike, they think, at the United States. Well, in the end, all of this says is that they are basically interested in overcoming nuclear missile defense systems, and the United States is now probably going to respond and build more aggressive systems instead of simply missile defense systems, and they will upgrade those. We are in a Cold War, no doubt about it.
Marcus, what do you make of that? Do you think that, as Peter there said, that Russia is being more aggressive here?
I don't believe Russia is being aggressive. I believe Russia is responding to a very serious threat to its national security. But if I may turn to the Russian president's speech today, I don't believe it was as significant or as revealing as some people are saying. Mr. Putin said that a nuclear attack against Russia of a large, medium or small nature would result in a Russian counterattack using Russian nuclear weapons. Well, there's nothing new there. I think also we need to take into consideration that Mr. Putin is responding to a very serious threat at the moment on Russia's western borders, a threat posed by NATO's presence there, and also the American nuclear missile defense shield. Now, none of that is really new news. The Russian leadership have been working on plans to try and neutralize that threat on its western borders. So as I said, I don't believe Mr. Putin's speech was as significant or as revealing today. But one thing I did pick up on is that he said, should an ally of the Russian Federation be attacked with nuclear weapons, then Russia would respond to that. Well, which Russian allies is Mr. Putin talking about? If he's talking about allies in the former Soviet Union, such as Belarus, then there is nothing new there, because the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states, are protected by the Russian nuclear umbrella, and that includes Ukraine. If, on the other hand, Mr. Putin was talking about a Russian ally such as Syria, well, then that is a completely different ballgame, and that would be very significant indeed.
All right, so Peter, doesn't it all come down to, Peter, the idea that Russia really has the right to defend itself and has the right to obviously strengthen its military, especially as it sees a NATO encirclement, it sees the United States nuclear posture review, for example, that the Trump administration is talking about being more aggressive when it comes to possibly using nuclear weapons in certain scenarios. The fact that George W. Bush withdrew from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty, all of that added up. Certainly Russia has a case to be made for wanting to strengthen its military, doesn't it?
No. The problem, the fundamental problem is that Russia is not accepting the fact that former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact former allies want to join NATO and have joined NATO. And the other aspect they can't accept is that a missile defense system is just that, a defense system. They view it as something that is an aggression, when it is fundamentally and inherently not an aggression. The real problem is North Korea. North Korea is the country that's been claiming it can hit the United States with nuclear missiles, threatening to actually hit islands in the Pacific, actually has launched missiles over Japan twice. This is the country that has been on our radar and which we have been recently added all these sanctions on. Now, if Russia wants to see itself as an ally of North Korea, it may be in a situation where Kim Jong-un acts independently, and he's threatened to launch missiles, and maybe he will. But that is where the real rhetoric about launching nuclear missiles is coming from. And that is what the United States has been focusing on the past few years. And to us, it's the real threat.
Marcus, what do you make of that? Do you think Russia is making much ado about something that isn't really that big a deal for it?
No, what the gentleman in New York said might as well have been a press release issued by the State Department or the Pentagon. In regard to NATO, NATO has demonstrated very clearly to the world that it is an antagonistic organization and a very dangerous organization. It proved that in the former Yugoslavia. In regard to the American defense shield, well, yes, officially speaking, it's called a defense shield, but of course, in reality, it threatens the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent, which means it upsets the balance of nuclear power between Russia and America. How would America react if on its borders there was a Russian-led military alliance? How would Russia react? How would America react if on its borders there was a Russian missile defense shield? We saw how the Americans reacted when the Soviet Union deployed ICBMs in Cuba. They would not tolerate it. But we have to look at the history here. In 2002, the Americans withdrew from the ABM treaty. That led to the establishment of the Missile Defense Agency, which led to the construction of the Missile Defense Shield, components of which are in Romania and Poland. And that Missile Defense Shield is a serious violation of the INF Treaty of 1987. Russia has no choice but to respond. And should an arms race break out, then it will, of course, be the fault of the Americans.
Peter, what do you make of that? Do you think there is a double standard here? If Russia were to have missile shields close to the U.S. border, certainly America wouldn't like that.
No, America wouldn't like that. But you know, the question is, to what degree can the countries that were formerly in the Warsaw Pact and were part of the Soviet Union be allowed to have their own policy? They don't want to be. They don't want Finlandization. They don't want Russia to determine what their own national security. So they have wanted to join NATO. They want more NATO exercises there, and they want the missile shield. Now, as you may know, that in the early part of February this year, a treaty went into effect that will last until 2021, and it can be seen as the last, we could call it high point for less nuclear missiles. It cut the number. And when we get to the year 2021, we're going to be faced with beginning all over. So what negotiations can be had with Russia by that point, remains to be seen. But Russia is posturing to see itself as being invincible. This is the word Putin used. And he said that basically they have built missiles now that can evade any kind of missile defense system. And if that isn't aggressive posturing, I don't know what is.
All right, so Marcus, we come back to that main point then. Essentially, Peter saying that it's Russia that's really, if there is going to be an arms race, it's fueling it.
One really does have to say it's like living in a nightmare world where 2 + 2 = 5. Russia is responding to a very serious threat on its western borders. Remember, if we go back to 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev, the then Soviet leader, consented to German reunification on the proviso from Washington that NATO would not expand eastwards beyond Germany's borders. Now, James Baker, the then American Secretary of State, confirmed that in his memoirs. That is an extremely significant area for Russia. We have to remember that Russia has been invaded countless times via its western borders, from Charles XII of Sweden to Napoleon Bonaparte to the Kaiser to the British and French expeditionary forces during the Russian Civil War, and then of course Adolf Hitler. Russia is extremely sensitive, and I would use the word paranoid, about its national security, and with good reason. The last invasion of Russia resulted in the deaths of 27 million. That is why Eastern Europe is such an important area for Russia. No one is saying, and I'm certainly not saying, that Eastern Europe should be under the influence of Russia or in Russia's sphere, but it should not be under the influence of the Americans, NATO in particular, because that is dangerous. Russia has a right to national security, and there is no point, the gentleman in New York, bringing North Korea into this, because I will say this again, whilst I'm not endorsing the North Korean political and economic system, why the North Koreans have developed nuclear capabilities, because they feel threatened by America and its regional allies. North Korea is surrounded by tens of thousands of American soldiers, and there is extremely aggressive rhetoric come in from Washington. And the North Koreans know that America has never attacked a country which has nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate defense for any country. So we should not try and demonize Russia. We should. Let's look at the country which is actually causing this global instability.
Peter, I wanted to ask as well, about Russia having the right to obviously national security. I wanted to throw this fact at you, if you allow me, Peter, and get your reaction to this. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute says that the United States outspends Russia by a factor of around 10 when it comes to the military. Why wouldn't Russia then see the United States as a threat, really, versus vice versa?
Well, the United States pays high salaries, and it's very hard to really get a feeling about how much is spent by each country and where the Defense Department budget is actually spent beyond salaries. But of course, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, Crimea first, then eastern Ukraine. And when that happened, the east against the Baltic. So all of these things add up to a Russia that is always the insulted and the injured, always posturing, and now they are claiming to be invincible. They have the invincible nuclear arms capability. And that notion of being invincible with nuclear arms is the most dangerous in the world.
All right, so Marcus, I'm glad that Peter brought up the issue of Ukraine, because that is something that, as you know, is spoken a lot about in the West as a way to talk about Russia and the fact that it's possibly looking to expand, et cetera, et cetera. How do you react to that used as an argument then for the need to control, quote unquote, Russia?
Well, I'm very happy to talk about Ukraine. In February 2014, a democratically elected Ukrainian president, let me say that again, a democratically elected Ukrainian president whose election victory in 2010 was recognized by the Americans and the Europeans, was overthrown in a Western-backed coup. And why was he overthrown? Because he chose to pursue closer economic relations with the Russian Federation as opposed to pursuing closer economic relations with the West. And he had every right to make that decision to move closer to Russia. He had a mandate from the Ukrainian electorate when they voted him in 2010. Now, once the legitimate president of Ukraine was overthrown, then chaos broke out in Ukraine, and some very, very repugnant forces came to power in Kiev, including anti-Semites, neo-Nazis, neo-fascists. Now, the people in the Crimea responded to events in Kiev. They didn't initiate what happened in Kiev. They responded to events in Kiev. They well remembered what happened to their ancestors in the Second World War when it came to Nazism and fascism. So what they did was they rallied themselves, they held a referendum on breaking away from Ukraine and rejoining Russia. That was a defensive measure, and really we must not tolerate this idea that Russia invaded the Crimea. No, the people of the Crimea chose to act to defend themselves. And let us not forget as well that there were something like 20,000 Russian soldiers legally stationed in Crimea as part of an agreement between Russia and Ukraine signed in 1997. But ultimately, it was the people of the Crimea responded to a Western-backed coup in Kiev, which brought some horrendous people to power, people who still are actually in power to this very day in Ukraine.
Peter, if we're talking about a track record of intervening in other countries, we can talk about the United States' various military interventions in the Middle East, for example. It's still in Syria, for example, without that government's permission. It's invaded Iraq. We can talk about NATO in Libya, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Certainly, the United States has no track record to stand on a moral high ground, does it?
Well, it does. For instance, Ask someone where the Crimean Tatars are in the Crimea today. Russia, once it invaded, got the leadership out of the country and has kept them out of the country. They asked about what the Soviet Union did to the Crimean Tatars in 1944. In fact, it was part of an overall Muslim deportation that eliminated lots of peoples from the Caucasus as well. So, you know, this country's, this Russia's idea that it can rewrite history and just simply claim that, you know, Crimean Tatars, oh, what Crimean Tatars? They don't want to address them, their right to live there. They could only resettle under an independent Ukraine. And of course, the revolution in Ukraine was a popular revolution. That's why there were so many tens and hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated in the Maidan before. So I think, you know, the Russia has a view that it always is the one that is the victim. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't.
So Marcus, it really all comes down to the fact that there's this fear, I don't know if that's the right word, of Russia wanting to bring back the USSR, the Soviet Union, expand its territories once again, you know, bring in the countries that separated from it back into its fold. Is that the correct view, do you think, of Russia? Is that what Russia wants?
If people in Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, if one day they want to reunite with Russia, if one day they want to form a new country, a new union, then they have every right to do that. And that is none of the business of the Americans or indeed the Europeans. But Russia is not trying to recreate the Soviet Union. Russia is simply trying to ensure, to guarantee its national security and the national security of its allies, be it in the former Soviet Union or elsewhere in the world, such as Syria. But I'd like to say to the gentleman in New York, be aware of this fact. In March 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev held a referendum in the Soviet Union. And the question before the Soviet people was this: do you want to preserve the Soviet Union? Now, the Baltic states did not take part in that referendum, but the rest of the republics did. Mm-hmm. In Ukraine, the result was something like 80% of Ukrainians voted to stay in the Soviet Union, to preserve the Soviet Union. So when you say that there was this revolution in 2014, there was a mass popular uprising, no, it was an uprising from a certain section of Ukrainian society. It certainly did not reflect the millions of people who live in Ukraine.
Okay, we just have under a minute left, gentlemen, so I want to get both your final comments, 30 seconds to each. Peter, Putin said they have not succeeded in holding Russia back. That's an exact quote. Now they need to take account of a new reality and understand that everything I have said today is not a bluff, when he spoke about, you know, the many military advances of the country. Does and has the West tried to hold Russia back, do you think?
I think it ignored Russia in its independence for maybe 15 years, certainly a dozen. It didn't do a Marshall Plan, which had been offered, and they really thought, the United States, that they didn't really need to be giving much aid when they did. And this is part of the result, what we are seeing now. But unfortunately, Russia, by Putin claiming nuclear invincibility, has set off a flame that I don't know where it will lead. Certainly
let me put that point then to Marcus.
And I hope nothing more.
Peter, Marcus, go ahead with your response to that. Go ahead.
The most important aspect of President Putin's speech today was him reiterating a reality that the golden days for America in the 1990s and the early 2000s are gone, are history, that the Russia of today is an extremely powerful, confident country, and American aggression, any American threats to Russian national security or to the national security of its allies will be met with a Russian nuclear strike.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll leave it there at that, but of course we do appreciate both your contributions to tonight's discussion. That was editor of Politics First, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who is speaking to us live from London, and we're also joined by independent scholar, Mr. Peter Sennett, who had been speaking to us live from New York. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.